2 years after COVID-19, African tourism has rebounded. According to an early December 2022 report focusing on West and Central Africa, first quarter of 2023 air ticket reservations to West Africa were 25% higher than in the first quarter 3 years ago. Projections further revealed that travel to Africa would return to pre-pandemic levels between 2023 and 2024. 2022 was not without some drama, though, as aviation disputes between countries and even visa restrictions provided moments of concern for the travel and tourism space. What barriers still hamper air travel interconnectivity within the continent, and how are African leisure and business travelers evolving in their destination preferences and use of online travel technology? Well, joining me to discuss this is Bayo Adedeji, the Group CEO of travel company Waka Now, who was previously a senior finance executive at Amazon. Waka Now has grown to become one of Africa's leading travel, tech, and booking portals. I'm also joined virtually by Adefunke Adeyemi, Secretary General of African Civil Aviation Commission, the specialized agency of the AU on all civil aviation matters. She's also the 2021 recipient of the Ato Germa Wake Lifetime Achievement Award for services to African air transport and trade. Welcome to the show. Great to have you both on the show. Absolutely. And I'm going to start with you, Adefunke, just to get your thoughts on how African aviation has fared in the past 2 years since the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Rolake, and it's a pleasure to be on the show. And hello and good morning to my co-participant. All right, so regarding African aviation, I think just to give some background context in terms of pre-COVID and what COVID did to African aviation and where we are today. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, African aviation was forecast to grow the second fastest in the year, up to 5.9% over 20 years. Or 20-year period, and that was really, really positive for the industry. And in 2019, African aviation did record numbers in terms of travel numbers and travel and trade, and really, really positive prospects. But having said that, let me also put some numbers in context for you. The first is that, with a a continental population of about 1.3 billion, it's disputed whether it's 1.2, 1.3, only about 115 million Africans travel by air. Now, you may wonder why this is, and it seems like these numbers are so incredible and so remarkable compared to our population. Well, one of the factors is that Africa has such a huge land mass. It's bigger than a lot of people think. The size of the continent is not the size that is represented on the map. And so, in order to cut across the continent, aviation is really a critical accelerator for moving people and goods and services across the continent.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, the level of infrastructure that has been put in place in terms of developing movement and integration across Africa focuses a lot on the other forms of transportation, like roads and rail, and building bridges. And while it is really important for Africa to have an integrated and intermodal form of transportation to really be able to traverse the continent, in terms of accelerating the movement of Africa, aviation is really a critical accelerator.
Of course.
And I use an example I use a lot, which is that if you build 3 kilometers of road, you take people from one point from the beginning of that 3 kilometers to the end of it. But if you build 3 kilometers of runway, people go from the beginning of that kilometer to anywhere in the world. And so COVID-19 did something really, really dramatic, which was to absolutely halt, and I mean stop, air travel across and within the continent of Africa.
And Adefunke, I'd like to come back and talk about the impact of COVID-19, to look at what the impact on consumer demand has been. But just going to Mr. Bayo Adedeji of Waka Now Group, in terms of a lot of the macroeconomic factors we've seen, inflation, interest rates, and FX devaluation, how have they impacted demand for tourism and travel in terms of your sector?
So thank you for having me, and thank you for, and nice having you, Adefunke. I think it's an interesting thing, and I think I'll focus on the FX piece. The FX piece has been one of the critical indicators for us in travel. a typical ticket to the US, let's take London, which is the biggest route right now, it used to be $1,000. At $1,000 before, we paid 400K for an economy seat.
That's 400,000 naira.
400,000 naira. Now, in that same $1,000, you're paying $700,000 or $750,000 for that same class seat. The airlines have reduced the size of the planes they bring into Nigeria, for an example, because of the lack of repatriation of their FX from here. So
they've actually reduced the size of the planes,
yes,
not because
capacity.
of infrastructure in the airport, but lack of repatriation of funds.
So everybody's kind of watching and making sure that they make the maximum dollars that they can make out of the market. Smaller aircraft, more fuel economical aircraft. And what you see is capacity is down, and the passenger now needs to pay more from their local currency. Think about what is happening in cities with inflation. Think about what's happening with the foreign exchange in Ghana. It just points you, the same in Sierra Leone, the same across Africa. It points you to the direction that the passenger is now having to pay more. However, it is an interesting dynamics that this has not reduced demand. Actually, more than we thought. We had projected that demand will fall. And what we're seeing is there is a lot of outbound demand. Some is one way, because students are now moving to the US, moving to the UK, moving to Canada. We're seeing a lot of one-way traffic that is significantly driving the business. And we're also seeing a lot of fund seekers that are now traveling into Africa.
Yeah.
And I know I'm going to your next question, potentially about the travel within Africa. What we've seen is people are moving to places where they can just go to. For instance, Dubai has been shut to Nigerians since last year. Nigerians can't get into Dubai. But yet, demand is still up as a whole for the travel industry across Africa. And it shows and it talks about the resilience of the Nigerian passenger and how they behave and how they believe in travel and how the opportunity in African tourism continues to expand.
And I'm curious to understand, so what destinations are really now hot? If you were to top 3 destinations for intra-African tourists within Africa, what destinations are proving really interesting?
So number one on our radar is, and I'm talking from a Nigerian passenger standpoint, because the dynamics of travel is very unique within the African continent. For instance, people in East Africa travel within East Africa. You find more inter-East Africa travel than you find them live in East Africa. That means people go from Kenya to Tanzania to Uganda to Rwanda. For us in the West Coast, in the west part of Africa, what we've seen is travel to Rwanda. Why? It's visa-free. Travel to Kenya is up because it is you easily get visa. We've seen travel to South Africa decline because of the complexity of getting visas now to South Africa. And the third destination that is really hot, I would say 2 more destinations that is really hot, is Egypt and Morocco. Wakana, for instance, did a deal in Egypt to get visa on arrival for Nigerians. We started doing 2,000 packs to Nigerians. For Nigerians to Egypt, which was a destination that was largely unknown.
Very, very, very interesting. And I think, Adefunke, it just goes to show how everything is so interconnected insofar as this sector is concerned. So I'd really like to hear from the perspective of the African Civil Aviation Commission, which you head. How is that commission advocating to boost air travel within the continent, especially then leading to greater intra-regional trade and intra-regional cooperation? What specifically is the organization doing?
Thank you very much. So just speaking a little bit to what my colleague was saying there, in terms of just demographics, because, we really look at the big picture first before we start drilling down into what initiatives are impactful and will generate results. In terms of demographic, we have a forecast from Goldman Sachs, for example, that there will be the slower economic growth over the next century up until 2080. At the same time, we have demographics that say that African population is going to explode, with Nigeria and Egypt being in the top 10 global populations by the year 2050, as well as a very highly mobile and young population who are willing to move and to travel. And with those demographics in mind, from the intra-African perspective, based on what I had said before about the constraints of other modes of transportation, aviation is really, really placed to become the accelerator. And not just because of moving people and goods around, but also because of what it actually does. It's an enabler for economic and social development, as we know. And of course, with the AFCFTA also being launched in 2020, we see aviation really performing a critical enabling role for moving trade and services across the continent. So in terms of the intra-African picture, During COVID, and as I was mentioning before, there was a total halt, meaning that because borders around the world were closed to African countries, I mean, it was everywhere, all borders were closed. But what was interesting was, for example, we saw a closure of Europe totally to Africa. And the biggest markets for African destinations are Europe and the East. And so there was really a very, very minimal movement between African countries. And that is really the opportunity that we saw at the African Civil Aviation Commission to be able to see how we accelerate the integration of African states. And so we have an initiative launched by the African Union in 2018 called the Single African Air Transport Market, which is designed to create, if you like, a domestic market across African countries where African cities can be connected, not just from point to point, but from point to point and beyond. And that's the real initiative as the executing agency of the African Union for the Single African Air Transport Market. AFCAC, our organization, recently launched an initiative called the SATAM Pilot Implementation Project, where we're going to cluster countries across Africa to see how we can fast track the development of new routes across them. Now, AFCAC is a regulatory body, and the airlines are the ones who operate the routes. And so it's a real partnership that has to happen between the regulatory and policy angle, as well as the operational angle, to see how we can really facilitate business from the airline side to start to see Africa as the preferred destination and really the place where they can see growth happening.
Yes, thank you. And I was going to ask you about, there was an initiative, I think, a couple of years ago, which was piloted, an African Union passport. And, you know, I want you, perhaps, Bayo, to come in here, really looking at the issues of visas and passports. Would an initiative like that really help to boost your industry, or do you see potential challenges with implementation?
Absolutely, and I talk from the private sector, so we're not big on policies. We're big on things that we can actually make money from, and having an African Union passport that is easy to get and is easy for passengers to get is a game changer. Number one is a leveler. I had a meeting in South Africa, and I had some colleagues that had to come for the meetings with me, and they couldn't get visas. And we're going for 3 days. You want to take someone to some parts of Africa that you will not believe how restrictive it is for Nigerians, for Africans to get visa for inter-Africa travel. You'll be shocked. The economic incentive to travel within West Africa that is visa-free is so enormous. Like, you go to Sierra Leone, you don't need a visa. You go, all you need is your yellow card document to be able to go into West Africa. And what we've seen is inter-Africa travel has increased. If you want to go to Abidjan today, there's a risk that your suitcase might not get there because the amount of cargo that the traders are putting on the aircraft to go to Abidjan out of Nigeria.
Yes.
Those are things that we don't talk about.
And in fact, that's a very interesting point, because in the business of travel, there's also some inefficiencies that do arise. And we need to take a break now. When we come back, we'll continue that very fascinating discussion with our two guests of WACAN Now and the Africa Civil Aviation Commission. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to Business Week here on Horizons. I've been talking to Bayo Adedeji, Group CEO of WACAN Now, the travel company, and Adefunke Adeyemi, the Secretary General of the Africa Civil Aviation Commission, on the outlook for travel and aviation. So I wanted to start with you again, Bayo, really looking around what efforts is the private sector doing to lobby or advocate for easier and smoother policies around visas and travel documentation for your industry?
So I won't use the word lobbying or advocating. What we do is we go with a commercial angle. I remember my conversation in Cairo about visa on arrival for Nigerians and for Ghanaians, as it were. And I remember how I told them that we guaranteed that we could do 2,000 packs a month, passengers a month. And if they charge us $50 per passenger, that is how much potential they can make, talk less of opening up to the entire market. Now, we did that. We got exclusivity for a year on that so that we can maximize the interest. And now they've opened up to a lot of other travel agencies to see more people should do it because they saw the commercial angle. I think that sometimes we try to have conversations from a commercial side. Namibia is another market that we're working to open up. And when we talk about Namibia, the biggest problem we have is connectivity. it is easier to go outside of Africa, to come back into Africa, to go just south of Africa to Namibia, which is ridiculous. So sometimes, even after we get the government agency on board and the immigrations on board, you now have the challenge of the infrastructure to get there. How do you fly there? What is the route to fly there? Now you can fly SAA to fly there. We didn't start the conversation around SAA. And I want to say that the lack of commercial viability, or the quantum of the commercial viability in some of these markets impacts the opening of the market. If there are 10 parks going to a certain country, you cannot, because of that, put an aircraft on the route of that. And sometimes that is what is affecting the African tourism, as it were. The African customer is still has an affinity for the outside of African market. That's why London is number one route. Dubai used to be number one route. The outside of African market. But what we've seen, again, and kudos to the African customer now, that as the world shuts us out of outside of Africa, and Africa starts to open up and give us a sign of hope, we've seen the African passengers starting to move. About 16% of our business now is inter-Africa travel, which has never been. Before, it used to be between the range of 8 and 9.
Very interesting. And speaking of, infrastructure and the actual structure of the industry, Adefunke, I want to ask you really around the integration of infrastructure. So if you look at airports, if you look at the facilities, even the experience of the African traveler, sometimes as Nigerians, we always marvel when we travel through certain airports on the continent. What can we really do to improve the infrastructure service provision within the African aviation system as a whole?
Thank you. All right, so just a few points from what Bayo said. I think, first of all, African travel is on the rebound. So passengers are traveling a lot more, and they're traveling a lot more intra-Africa, as he mentioned. The other is that African tourism is also on the rebound, and I think the two are obviously closely related. Now, in terms of the issues around integrating Africa, not just from an infrastructural point of view, but also from a seamless movement point of view, I think there's several building blocks here. There's one is the regulatory aspect, a lot of which we handle. And we do a lot of lobbying and advocacy with governments and with businesses as well to speak to the benefits of a better integrated Africa by air and by other forms of transportation. One is that it leads to better economic growth, for sure, better social growth, because people have opportunities to move around. And so lower fares as well, it increases competition and so on. And we've seen this happen in other parts of the world. So what we're trying to advocate for is not new and is not something that is impossible for the African continent. And that's the reason why we have the single African air transport market. And we're pursuing this as one of the key agendas for Africa's socio-economic development. Now, in terms of infrastructure, just yesterday and the day before, there was a Dakar Financing Summit of the African Union, NEPAD, the infrastructure arm of the AU. And we heard a lot of talk and money about other forms of transportation, but not aviation necessarily. And that is why we need to do a lot more advocacy to shift that thinking and the mindset around the traditional forms of transportation to moving it to what is more modular. And aviation is actually a modular form of transportation, if you think about it. You have, planes coming and landing, you have runways, and then you have the facilities that enable them. And the facilities don't have to be huge, they don't have to be big, they don't have to be the best. As you say, as Nigerians, the Nigerians who travel, Africans who travel, we see a lot of this in other parts of the world. But I think the focus really should be more on the functionality of the infrastructure that supports that movement. Yeah. And so even if you have a container that is well addressed, and we see this happen in so many parts of the world where we have containerized infrastructure, that is something that can support the areas where the infrastructure is not quite as advanced. Yeah.
Can I quickly ask you a follow-on question to that? Should we be looking at more partnerships of mergers and acquisitions within the whole space? And how do you see that panning out?
Absolutely. I was just about to come to that. That speaking about, the viability of routes and the commercial viability. Of course, airlines who operate routes, they're businesses and they're commercial entities. They make commercial decisions. But there's also the element of it, or the other side of it, which is build it and they will come. It's almost like the chicken and the egg. Today, we're doing mapping under the single African air transport market, looking at where passengers are going within Africa and why. And because we're trying to integrate Africa better and create new routes across Africa.
Thank you very much. And Bayo, very quickly, how do you see technology impacting the travel portal segment of your industry? Very quickly.
Actually, super big. When you think about the advent of the customer coming online to purchase, we're seeing a max influx of customers trying to purchase. You can see travel agencies springing up with online OTAs springing up now in Africa. And I'll skip a little bit and go to fintech. And the role that fintech plays. With the cashless society that is going across, the wave of cashless society going across Africa, what we've seen is that OTAs are now playing a critical role in terms of...
That's online travel
agency are now playing a critical roles in integrating that fintech, because remember, travel is a high value purchase. Now, in our business, 25% of our customers paid small last year. That means they use a fintech financing product to pay small through a partner company called Calabash. That is amazing that 25% of a customer, 1 out of 4, is now using fintech. And that opens up to the opportunity that happens in the real world. Now, AI. And I know you're probably going to talk about metaverse and AI. In the event of metaverse is allowing the customer to visit an hotel before actually visiting the hotel. With virtual reality, being able to see that hotel before actually booking the hotel, and being able to visit an airport in Lungi in Sierra Leone, or visit Nairobi before actually getting there. And we're seeing that transcend. ChatGPT is coming in. We are thinking about it because conversational commerce is big in Africa. The African customer likes to talk to you, likes to get confidence, likes to feel that they know who they are giving their money to, because it's $1,000 purchase.
Yes.
So and AI now plays a critical role in doing that, and we are blazing the trail there.
Well, very fascinating discussion there. Thank you so much, Bayo Adedeji, Group CEO of WACA Now and Secretary General of the Africa Civil Aviation Commission, Adefunke Adeyemi, for your insights on travel, tourism, and the aviation outlook for Africa in 2023. Hopefully, we'll keep flying high on this journey to improve the sector. Well, that's all for Business Week. Thank you for watching. I look forward to bringing you more perspectives next week. Don't forget to join the conversation online and share your thoughts on Twitter. I'm Rolake Akinkwe Filani. Bye for now.